4 months after Pearl Harbor. America wanted revenge. There was only one problem. To strike Japan from a carrier, American forces would have to sail deep into waters patrolled by Japan, putting the carrier itself at enormous risk. Military planners called the idea impossible. Fighter aircraft couldn't carry enough bombs. Heavy bombers couldn't take off from an aircraft carrier. Medium bombers had never even attempted it. Yet one man believed there was a way. His plan sounded almost insane. Launch 16 Army bombers from a Navy aircraft carrier, bomb the Japanese home islands. Then keep flying until they reach China. No fighter escort. No possibility of returning to the carrier. No guarantee there would even be enough fuel to survive. Many believed the crews were volunteering for a one-way mission. But on April 18, 1942, they proved the impossible could fly. This is the story of the B-25 Mitchell and the mission nobody believed was possible. On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor transformed the United States overnight. The Pacific Fleet had been badly damaged. Battleships burned in the harbor. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. Across the country, shock quickly turned into anger. The American public wanted an answer. Not months later, not years later, now. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that the United States needed more than a military victory. It needed a psychological one. Pearl Harbor had shattered America's confidence. The country needed proof that Japan was not beyond reach. The attack wouldn't need to destroy factories or cripple the Japanese military. It needed to send a message. No nation was untouchable. Somewhere inside the military, planners began asking an almost unbelievable question. Could an Army bomber take off from a Navy aircraft carrier? In January 1942, a Navy captain named Francis Lowe was flying into an airfield in Norfolk, Virginia. Below him, painted onto the runway, was the outline of a carrier deck. Navy pilots used it for practice landings. But that morning, Lowe saw something else. 2 Army twin-engine bombers thundered low across the painted deck, and a thought struck him that nobody had ever had before. What if they didn't just fly over it? What if they took off from it? The proposal reached senior commanders. Most thought it was unrealistic. Some called it reckless. But one person believed it deserved a closer look. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the US Fleet. King authorized further study. If the mission could be made to work, it might become the first American strike against Japan. The next challenge was choosing the right aircraft. Several bombers were considered. Some lacked the necessary range. Others were too large, too heavy, or required far more runway than a carrier could provide. One aircraft stood out above the rest, the North American B-25 Mitchell. Named after aviation pioneer General Billy Mitchell, it was already proving itself as a capable medium bomber. It was fast enough, sturdy enough, and most importantly, it could take off in an astonishingly short distance. The Mitchell wasn't designed for aircraft carriers. It had never been intended for naval service. It was built for conventional airfields, carrying bombs deep behind enemy lines. Its high-mounted wing provided good lift at lower speeds. Its sturdy landing gear handled rough airstrips with ease. The aircraft was stable, forgiving, reliable. Exactly the qualities needed for an operation where there would be almost no margin for error. Even then, simply choosing the B-25 didn't solve the problem. The bomber still weighed more than 15 tons. Launching it from a carrier remained something no one had ever accomplished. The Army turned to one man whose reputation made him the obvious choice. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, better known simply as Jimmy Doolittle. He wasn't just an experienced pilot, he was one of the finest aviators in America. Before the war, Doolittle had set speed records, won air races, earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, and helped pioneer instrument flying that allowed aircraft to operate safely in poor weather. If anyone possessed both the technical knowledge and the courage to attempt an impossible mission, it was Jimmy Doolittle. When he was offered command of the operation, he accepted immediately. Then he began looking for volunteers. The mission they were offered came with no guarantees. The crews would launch from an aircraft carrier somewhere in the Pacific, bomb military and industrial targets across Japan, then continue west toward China. There would be no landing back aboard the carrier, no friendly airfield waiting nearby, no rescue force if something went wrong. Everything depended on reaching China before the fuel tanks ran dry. Many of the volunteers quietly accepted the possibility that they might never return. Even so, applications poured in. The chance to strike back after Pearl Harbor outweighed the enormous risks. Preparing the B-25 bombers required extensive modifications. Weight became the enemy. Anything considered unnecessary was removed. Defensive equipment was reduced. Extra fuel tanks were installed wherever space allowed. The bombers would carry nearly twice their normal fuel capacity. Even the tail guns received an unusual modification. To discourage attacks from behind without adding unnecessary weight, some aircraft carried simple wooden poles painted black to resemble machine guns. From a distance, enemy pilots couldn't easily tell the difference. Every pound saved increased the bombers' chances of reaching China. Every gallon of fuel could mean the difference between survival and ditching into the Pacific. By early 1942, the aircraft had been selected. The crews had volunteered. The bombers were being transformed for a mission unlike any ever attempted. Only one obstacle remained. No one knew whether a B-25 could actually leave the deck of an aircraft carrier. The calculations looked frightening. The margin for error measured only a few feet. A slight mistake, a gust of wind, or a moment's hesitation would send bomber and crew straight into the Pacific Ocean. Before they could bomb Japan, they first had to prove something every expert believed was impossible, that a medium bomber could fly from the deck of an aircraft carrier. The challenge was staggering. A B-25 Mitchell normally used well over 1,000 feet of runway to become airborne. The deck of an aircraft carrier offered barely 500. There would be no second attempt, no room to abort. Either the bomber flew, or it disappeared into the Pacific. Training began at Eglin Field in Florida under a veil of secrecy. The crews weren't told exactly where they would be flying. They only knew their mission would require the shortest takeoff of their lives. Navy officers marked sections of runway to match the length of a carrier's flight deck. Pilots lined up at one end, advanced the throttles, released the brakes, and aimed for an imaginary ocean waiting beyond the pavement. Again and again and again. Every takeoff became a lesson in precision. There was no room for hesitation. Every foot mattered. The key was technique. Pilots learned to hold the brakes while advancing both Wright-R 2600 engines to maximum power. Only when the engines reached full output did they release the aircraft. The Mitchell surged forward. As it accelerated, pilots fought the powerful torque, pulling the aircraft sideways. There was no gradual climb, no long acceleration. The bomber lifted off only moments before reaching the end of the marked runway. Sometimes with barely a few feet to spare. By the end of training, many crews could consistently leave the ground in less than 500 feet. The impossible was beginning to look achievable. While the crews trained, the bombers kept changing. The lower gun turret was stripped out entirely. By the time modifications were complete, each B-25 carried more than 1,100 gallons of fuel, far more than a standard Mitchell. The bomb load was carefully chosen, heavy enough to make the raid meaningful, light enough to give the aircraft a chance of reaching China. Even navigation received special attention. Flying hundreds of miles across open ocean offered almost no landmarks. One mistake could send an entire crew into empty sea with no hope of rescue. Jimmy Doolittle watched every stage of the preparation. He wasn't the kind of commander who stayed behind a desk. He flew with his crews, practiced the same takeoffs, faced the same risks. The volunteers respected him not simply because of his reputation, but because he demanded nothing from them that he wasn't willing to do himself. Confidence spread throughout the group. The mission still seemed dangerous, but it no longer seemed impossible. If Doolittle believed it could succeed, perhaps it really could. On April 1st, 1942, 16 modified B-25 Mitchells arrived at Naval Air Station Alameda in California. There, one by one, they were carefully lifted aboard the brand new aircraft carrier USS Hornet. The sight stunned many sailors. Army bombers sitting on the deck of a Navy carrier looked almost absurd. The Mitchells occupied nearly the entire flight deck. There was no room left for the carrier's own fighters to launch. Hornet herself would be almost defenseless until the bombers departed. It was an extraordinary gamble, one unlike anything attempted before. On April 2nd, 1942, Hornet slipped quietly out of San Francisco Bay. Her destination was known only to a handful of men. Several days later, she rendezvoused with USS Enterprise, whose fighters would provide protection for the task force. Together, the two carriers steamed west toward Japan. Every mile brought them closer to enemy patrols. The crews checked their aircraft constantly: engines, fuel, bombs, navigation. There would be almost no room for error. If everything went according to plan, they might just make it. But war rarely follows the plan. During the early hours of April 18th, while still hundreds of miles from the planned launch point, American lookouts spotted a Japanese patrol vessel. It was one of several picket boats positioned far from Japan to provide early warning of approaching enemy fleets. The small vessel had seen them. Although American gunfire quickly sank the boat, radio operators almost certainly transmitted a warning before it disappeared beneath the waves. The element of surprise was gone. Japanese forces now knew something was approaching. No one knew exactly what. But waiting any longer was no longer an option. The American task force faced a brutal decision: continue toward the planned launch point and risk enemy aircraft finding the carriers, or launch immediately. Launching now meant taking off nearly 650 miles from Japan, over 200 miles farther than planned. Those extra miles could prove fatal. The Mitchells already carried every gallon of fuel they possibly could. There was no reserve, no backup plan. Every additional mile reduced the crew's chances of reaching China. The calculations Doolittle had spent weeks refining were suddenly worthless. Yet there was only one choice. The mission would go ahead. The bombers would launch immediately. And as the crews climbed into their cockpits, every man aboard understood the truth. Bombing Japan was no longer the greatest challenge. The real challenge was surviving the journey home. At 8:20 a.m. on April 18, 1942, the first B-25 rolled toward the bow of USS Hornet. Towering waves crashed against the carrier as it pitched violently in the Pacific. The flight deck rose, then fell. The Mitchells' twin Wright Cyclone engines roared at full power. Jimmy Doolittle held the brakes, waited for the perfect moment, then released them. The bomber surged forward. There was no room for hesitation, no second attempt. Only a few hundred feet separated the aircraft from the ocean. As the Mitchell reached the end of the flight deck, it seemed to sink toward the waves. For a brief, terrifying moment, many sailors believed it wouldn't make it. Then the bomber slowly climbed away. Cheers erupted across the carrier. The impossible had just become reality. One after another, the remaining 15 Mitchells followed. Each launch looked almost identical. The aircraft raced toward the edge of the carrier, dropped alarmingly close to the water, then clawed their way into the sky. Within little more than an hour, all 16 bombers were airborne. Not a single aircraft had been lost. The most dangerous takeoffs of the mission were over. Now came the longest flight of their lives. For hours, the Mitchells flew alone across the Pacific. To avoid early detection, they remained at low altitude whenever possible. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath them. Fuel gauges slowly crept downward. Radio silence was maintained. Each crew navigated independently toward Japan. There would be no fighter escort, no support aircraft. If something went wrong, they were on their own. Shortly after midday, the Japanese coastline appeared on the horizon. For many crew members, it was the first time they had ever seen the enemy's homeland. The sight carried enormous significance. Since the outbreak of the war, Japan had attacked others without fearing retaliation against its own cities. That illusion was about to disappear. The bombers split toward their assigned targets: Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, factories, military installations. The crews weren't ordered to destroy entire cities. Their goal was to prove something much simpler. America could strike Japan itself. The raids unfolded with surprising speed. Japanese air defences were caught almost completely off guard. Some anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. A handful of fighters attempted interceptions. But confusion spread quickly. Many Japanese commanders simply hadn't believed American bombers could appear over the home islands. The attack lasted only minutes. Bombs fell across military and industrial targets. Smoke rose above factories. Warehouses burned. Dock facilities suffered damage. Compared with the massive bombing campaigns that would follow later in the war, the physical destruction was relatively limited. But that had never been the true objective. The mission was about psychology, and psychologically, it was devastating. As quickly as they had appeared, the B-25s turned west. The hardest part of the mission had just begun. Every bomber was now flying far beyond its planned range. Fuel consumption had increased during the unexpectedly long approach. Headwinds slowed their progress. One by one, navigators realized the same terrible truth. The bombers were unlikely to reach their intended airfields in China. The crews continued anyway. There was no alternative. No carrier waiting behind them. No friendly island within reach. Only the vast darkness ahead. Night fell as the Mitchells crossed the coast of China. Rain and low clouds reduced visibility almost to zero. Fuel gauges approached empty. One engine after another began sputtering. Pilots searched desperately for the airfields they expected to find. Most couldn't locate them. Finally, Doolittle gave the order every crew had hoped to avoid. Bail out. One after another, American airmen jumped into the darkness over occupied China. Others crash-landed their Mitchells in fields, on beaches, or in rice paddies. One crew, unable to reach China at all, turned north to the Soviet Union and landed near Vladivostok, where they were interned for more than a year before finally escaping. Miraculously, most of the raiders survived the flight itself, but many now found themselves deep inside Japanese-occupied territory. Their ordeal was far from over. Chinese civilians risked everything to hide and rescue the American airmen. They provided food, shelter, medical care, and guides who led them through occupied territory. Their courage would cost them more than anyone imagined. In America, the news broke before most of the crews were even safe. Across the United States, newspapers hailed the raid as the first American strike against Japan. For a nation still recovering from Pearl Harbor, the psychological impact was enormous. The impossible mission had succeeded. When reporters later asked President Franklin D. Roosevelt where the bombers had launched from, he famously smiled and replied, "Shangri-La," a fictional paradise from James Hilton's novel Lost Horizon. The joke concealed the Navy's secret, but it also created a legend. The physical damage inflicted by 16 B-25 bombers had been modest. Yet the consequences were about to reshape the entire Pacific War. Inside Japan, the shock cut deeper than any bomb. For years, Japanese leaders had assured their people that the home islands were secure. The Imperial Navy believed its defensive perimeter stretched far enough into the Pacific to prevent exactly this kind of attack. The Doolittle raid shattered that belief overnight. If 16 bombers could reach Tokyo, what might happen if hundreds came later? Japan's military leadership immediately began searching for answers. The raid became one of the factors that helped push Japanese leaders toward a more aggressive strategy in the Central Pacific. They decided to expand their defensive perimeter even farther east. That decision placed enormous importance on one tiny island, Midway. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed capturing Midway would force the American carriers into battle, where they could finally be destroyed. The plan seemed logical, but instead, it created the very opportunity the United States had been waiting for. Just 7 weeks after the Doolittle raid, 4 Japanese fleet carriers sailed toward Midway. None would survive. Many historians still argue that without the Doolittle raid, Japan might never have accelerated its plans for Midway in the way it did. The mission that seemed too small to matter had helped set the stage for one of the greatest turning points of the Second World War. For the American people, the raid was nothing short of electrifying. Only 4 months had passed since Pearl Harbor. Newspapers had been filled with stories of defeat. The Philippines had fallen, Wake Island had fallen, Guam had fallen. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. Then came headlines announcing that American bombers had struck Tokyo itself. The military value of the attack mattered less than its symbolism. It proved that Japan was not beyond reach. It proved America could fight back. Perhaps most importantly, it restored confidence. The nation that had been shocked into war finally had a victory to celebrate. The raid also transformed the reputation of the B-25 Mitchell. Before April 1942, it was simply another medium bomber entering service. Reliable, capable, but largely unknown to the public. After the raid, it became a symbol of American determination. As the war continued, the Mitchell served in nearly every theatre. It bombed Axis airfields in North Africa, supported Allied advances in Italy, attacked shipping in the Pacific, flew dangerous low-level missions over Burma and New Guinea. Some versions even carried a massive 75mm cannon, making them among the heaviest armed aircraft of the war. Others were equipped with multiple forward-firing machine guns for devastating strafing attacks. The B-25 continually adapted to new missions. It proved just as versatile as it was reliable. By the end of the war, nearly 10,000 Mitchells had been built, serving with air forces around the world. For Jimmy Doolittle, the mission ended very differently than he expected. After reaching safety, he believed he had failed. Every bomber had been lost. Several crews had been captured. The planned recovery in China had collapsed. Doolittle was convinced he would face severe criticism for losing all 16 aircraft. Instead, he returned home to a hero's welcome. President Franklin D. Roosevelt awarded him the Medal of Honor and promoted him to Brigadier General. The mission had achieved exactly what America needed. Not a crushing military victory, but proof that courage, innovation, and determination could overcome impossible odds. The raid wasn't without tragedy. 3 American airmen lost their lives during the mission. 8 crew members were captured by Japanese forces. 3 were executed. 1 died in captivity. The Chinese civilians who helped rescue the surviving crews paid an even heavier price. In the months that followed, Japanese forces carried out brutal reprisals against Chinese civilians accused of helping the American airmen. Thousands were killed, and entire communities were devastated. It remains one of the darkest chapters connected to the raid. Behind every famous military operation are countless untold sacrifices. The Doolittle raid was no exception. Looking back, it's remarkable how improbable the entire mission really was. An Army bomber launched from a Navy carrier, crews trained in complete secrecy, a flight beyond the limits of the aircraft's range, no fighter escort, no possibility of returning to the carrier, no guarantee of survival. By almost every conventional military standard, the operation should never have succeeded. Yet it did. Not because everything went according to plan, in fact, almost nothing did. The bombers launched early. They ran dangerously low on fuel. Every aircraft was lost. But the mission succeeded because the objective was never simply to destroy buildings. It was to change the course of the war. And it did exactly that. Today, the B-25 Mitchell is remembered not only for its combat record, but for proving that bold ideas can alter history. It wasn't the biggest bomber of the Second World War. It wasn't the fastest. It wasn't the most technologically advanced. But on one extraordinary morning in April 1942, 16 B-25 bombers accomplished something the world believed was impossible. They carried America's resolve across the Pacific. They struck the enemy where he felt safest. And they reminded both friend and foe that wars are fought as much in the mind as they are on the battlefield. Sometimes, history doesn't change because a mission destroys the most targets. Sometimes, it changes because someone is willing to attempt the mission everyone else says can't be done. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the aircraft, engineering breakthroughs, and untold stories that shaped World War II, and let me know in the comments. Which legendary aircraft, mission, or battle should we cover next? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.